The waiter leaned in during our anniversary dinner and whispered something that froze my husband. He didn't look angry or confused, just careful, like this wasn't the first warning. When the same sentence came again with our drinks, I stopped swallowing. That was the moment I knew dessert was never coming. I sat back slightly, forcing my fingers to unclench, pretending calm while my mind raced through possibilities I couldn't yet speak. Julian kept his posture steady, almost casual, but I could feel the tension ripple through him like a warning. The waiter's eyes flicked between us, careful, precise, and the words repeated again, deliberate, mechanical. "Sir, the guest in room 4 is still waiting for the payment." I let the phrase hang in the air, tasting the threat in its rhythm, observing Julian's subtle flinch, the brief tightening of his jaw. Every inch of his body seemed to whisper secrets I wasn't supposed to know yet, and yet the clues were right in front of me. I sipped my wine slowly, letting it burn slightly as I watched him measuring, calculating, pretending ease, but his gaze betrayed him in tiny flashes. The restaurant around us continued its quiet chatter, oblivious, while our private tension thickened like a storm about to break. The appetizer arrived, plated like a ritual, but I barely noticed. My eyes stayed on him, scanning every twitch of fingers, every blink, every hesitation. When the waiter leaned in again, whispering the same sentence, I felt my chest tighten involuntarily, every instinct screaming that this was no ordinary dinner. I noticed Julian's subtle micro-smile, fleeting, and I realized the game had begun, the silent battle unfolding over whispers and wine. Every word from the waiter felt like a probe, a thread I could pull to unravel the truth, and I was catching on faster than he expected. The main course was brought, and yet I couldn't focus on food, my mind caught in a web of suspicion, curiosity, and that creeping, unbearable tension. I caught him watching me with an almost imperceptible calm, the kind that unnerves more than shouts ever could. My hands tightened slightly around my glass, nails pressing into the rim, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, silently warning him that I was noticing everything. The waiter's repeated words weren't just a message, they were a rhythm, a test, and I could feel the trap weaving itself around the table. Julian finally let his eyes meet mine fully, calm, controlled, yet with a hidden current I couldn't yet name. I felt a spark of anger, curiosity, fear, all tangled together, but I held my expression steady, letting the moment stretch, letting the words sink into our space. "Julian, who is in room 4? What payment are you hiding?" I said, voice low, precise, trying not to reveal how much I already suspected. He didn't answer immediately, just held my gaze, letting the silence carry weight, letting my questions hang like shadows between us. Every pause, every sip, every glance between us was a battlefield, subtle, unseen, but deadly in its consequences. The waiter circled lightly, mechanical, silent, and I realized the repetition of that single sentence had already started bending the room toward revelation. I leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowing, trying to read him, trying to catch a hint of weakness in the calm mask he wore. He didn't give it, not overtly, not at all, and I felt the faintest spike of frustration prick the edge of my patience. The repeated sentence from the waiter had stopped, yet its echo lingered, a quiet pressure I could feel under my skin. I forced a smile, letting it float across my lips like armor, letting Julian think I was settling, when in reality, my mind was racing. I traced subtle patterns in his behavior, counting blinks, micro-tremors in fingers, the lift of shoulders, all catalogued silently, waiting for the right moment. Every suppressed word, every withheld glance, added to the ledger I was building in my mind, calculating advantage in the invisible war at the table. I realized that control wasn't loud, it wasn't forceful, it was measured, quiet, and Julian's calm was a weapon aimed at testing me. I let a fraction of impatience slip through my posture, just enough to see if he would react, and he didn't. Not a twitch. My chest tightened as I weighed the repeated whispers, the subtle power they carried, and I began to map his strategy against my own. Every subtle pressure from him was a question, a probe, and I could feel the trap forming, silent, unavoidable if I misstepped. I let my hands rest lightly on the table, controlled, poised, while my mind dissected every nuance, every hint, every hidden signal. I understood fully that Julian wasn't flustered. He was patient, waiting, letting me reveal the patterns he already knew I carried. I shifted slightly, letting my gaze settle on him, almost casual, yet charged with observation, and I realized the true battle wasn't in words. It was in restraint, in silence, in the careful dance of revealing just enough and hiding the rest. Every twitch of a lip, every flex of a finger, every hesitation in my voice would be recorded, remembered, weaponized. And I couldn't stop thinking that perhaps I was already losing, even as I plotted my next move. I leaned back just slightly, letting the quiet weight of anticipation settle over the table, knowing the game had only begun. The main course had grown cold in front of us, but I barely noticed, eyes locked on Julian, watching for any slip. The waiter returned, leaning slightly, voice low, precise, every word cutting through the air like a subtle blade. "Sir, the guest in room 4 is still waiting for the payment." I felt my pulse tighten, the words echoing in my mind, each repetition amplifying the weight of suspicion pressing into my chest. Julian's calm remained unshaken, almost unnerving, his eyes fixed on me with that controlled, unreadable patience that made my blood run cold. I forced a deep breath, letting it out slowly, fighting the urge to speak, to demand answers, to unravel the tension building around us. I noticed the way his fingers flexed against the table, deliberate, measured, subtle cues that betrayed nothing, yet hinted at everything. Every repeated whisper from the waiter felt like a countdown, a trigger I couldn't fully interpret, a rhythm I was forced to follow. I sipped my wine, hiding the way my hands shook slightly, the way my mind spun faster than I wanted it to, calculating, predicting, second-guessing. Julian's eyes flicked toward the waiter, almost imperceptibly, and then returned to me, calm, controlled, patient, letting me stew in the pressure. My chest tightened further as I realized the repetition wasn't random. It was deliberate, testing me, drawing out every reaction, every crack in composure. I felt the edge of fear mixed with fascination, the strange thrill that comes when the invisible rules of a game are suddenly revealed. I leaned forward slightly, gaze sharpening, trying to catch even the faintest hint of strategy, of confession, but Julian's mask held perfectly. Every pause between whispers became a weight I could feel in my bones, a quiet countdown toward revelation, toward collapse, toward truth. The waiter stepped back momentarily, but his presence lingered like a shadow, mechanical, deliberate, always waiting, always watching. Julian's calm was infuriating, unsettling, and yet I realized it was designed to force me into revealing more than I intended. My hands gripped the edge of the table lightly, nails pressing into wood, as I measured, calculated, tried to find the gap, the weakness, the slip. Every breath I took felt heavy, each second stretching impossibly, as the tension at our table thickened into something almost unbearable. The repeated phrase arrived again, crisp, deliberate, mechanical, perfectly timed. "Sir, the guest in room 4 is still waiting for the payment." I froze just slightly, and for a fraction of a second, my mask cracked, my eyes betraying the swirl of suspicion, fear, and calculation I tried to hide. Julian's calm gaze caught it immediately, unshaken, almost triumphant in its restraint, and I realized he was already ahead in this silent war. Every muscle in my body felt caught in a trap I couldn't see fully, every microreaction cataloged, every hesitation noted, every twitch remembered. I let a subtle exhale escape, letting him feel the pressure, while internally preparing to counter, to survive, to hold my composure at all costs. I leaned back, eyes narrowing, feeling the invisible tension tighten like a noose around the table, knowing the next shift could break everything. The waiter leaned in, voice low, deliberate, but this time, he didn't look at me. He looked directly at Clara, eyes scanning hers with subtle insistence, a trigger finally released. "Madam, the guest in room 4 is still waiting for the payment." Her smile faltered, just slightly, confusion crossing her face in a way that made the room feel heavier, charged. I kept my posture loose, calm, letting the shift settle fully, letting her miscalculation bloom without interruption. Clara's sharp eyes widened, realization dawning too late, as the pieces she thought she controlled now slipped quietly from her hands. I reached slowly for the small digital screen the waiter had placed beside us earlier, letting it hover in view. The live feed came into focus, showing a private investigator seated beside a lawyer, calm, patient, already prepared, already recording every reaction. Clara's breath hitched, her composure cracking, the confident mask sliding ever so slightly as the reality sank in. Her own words, her admissions, her ambitions, they were all recorded, cataloged, irrefutable, proof of the game she had thought she played flawlessly. The restaurant seemed to shrink, every patron a distant blur, every sound muted except the quiet click of realization in her mind. I watched her closely, letting her mind race, letting the panic rise just enough to see the cracks widen. The repeated phrase, mechanical, ritualistic, had done its work, each iteration a lever pulling her closer to exposure. She finally understood fully. The payment was never money, never debt. It was evidence, patience, observation, the culmination of strategy. Clara's voice faltered, a whisper now, stripped of control, stripped of authority. You knew." I nodded slightly, slowly, measured, letting the weight of her own miscalculation hang between us like steel. The doors behind us opened, footsteps measured, uniformed officers moving in calmly, silently, already informed, already ready to act. The air shifted, subtle, undeniable, as control left her completely and settled in my hands without a sound. I signed the papers she had slid across, careful, deliberate, and added a single line beneath my name. "You won't be receiving insurance, settlements, or apologies. Only consequences," I said softly, letting each word land with quiet authority. The handcuffs clicked, soft yet final, and Clara's posture stiffened, rigid, frozen in disbelief as she was guided away. Her eyes didn't meet mine again, because she finally understood that it wouldn't help, that the table had already decided the outcome. I sat back slowly, letting the quiet settle, letting the normal rhythm of the restaurant resume around the irreversible shift. Nothing needed to be shouted, nothing needed to be explained. The lesson had been delivered in silence, observation, and precision. The waiter nodded once, professional, completing the role perfectly, and then melted back into the shadows from which he had appeared. And in that moment, I realized the loudest power shifts happen without sound. I exhaled slowly, letting the quiet certainty sink fully, knowing the game had ended, and the truth could never be rewritten. The restaurant hummed with life again, soft chatter returning, yet at our table, the air was quiet, heavy with finality. I straightened slowly, placing my napkin carefully back on the table, letting the weight of the evening settle fully. Julian's face, measured, calm, unshaken, reflected something deeper than victory, something quieter, the understanding that some truths need no audience. The waiter melted back into the shadows, his role complete, silent, precise, leaving only evidence, control, and clarity in the space he had occupied. I sipped the last of my wine, letting warmth settle into my chest, thinking of how power rarely needs force. Authority is not raised voices, not confrontation, not chaos. It is measured patience, observation, and letting the moment arrive fully on its own. I realized the smallest gestures, repeated phrases, and micro-reactions could be weapons, evidence, or truth, depending on who is patient enough to notice. And in silence, I saw the clarity I had sought for 7 years finally crystallize, leaving no room for doubt, only certainty. Some endings are quiet because they are final. Some lessons are clear because the consequences have already arrived. I understood that control isn't about winning immediately. It's about waiting until all paths are revealed, until no escape remains. The world outside continued, indifferent to the subtle battle that had concluded within the walls of a quiet restaurant. But inside me, I carried the understanding that trust, patience, and observation are the real currencies of any relationship, of any negotiation. And I knew, if you ignore the signs, if you let certainty feel safer than truth, the consequences will arrive anyway, quietly, inevitably. I left the table slowly, unhurried, each step measured, knowing the story had ended, lessons preserved, and authority remained unchallenged. Sometimes, the loudest victories are the ones delivered without a sound, without celebration, only recorded, only remembered, only respected. And as the night air hit my face, sharp and clean, I understood fully. The truth, when handled carefully, cannot be rewritten. Power isn't shown in chaos. It is claimed quietly, measuredly, and preserved long after the room has emptied.